Hello and welcome everyone to yet another episode of Mindshift and Modeshift, the interview series that we've been doing on all things sustainability. And for this session in July, we are specifically talking about a broader perspective of sustainability. So we are talking with experts in sustainable living in general, not just about transportation. So we have OneEarth Living joining here, and we have Dagmar Timmer joining here from OneEarth Living, the managing director. What we are going to discuss today is something about transportation, something about workplace, and how our choices will shape our behavior. OneEarth Living does a lot of interesting resources in terms of behavioral change and motivations. I personally find it very fascinating, coming from a behavioral science and behavioral economics kind of angle. We find it very fascinating how motivations and sustainable behavioral change could be implemented. So off we go with today's session. And to give a little bit of an introduction, Dagmar, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, about OneEarth Living, and this new report that we've been talking about recently.
Thank you so much, Venkatesh. It's wonderful to be here today and to share a little bit about this report that we're developing. So, as you noted, I'm Dagmar, and I'm Managing Director of Strategic Initiatives for OneEarth Living, which works to mainstream sustainable ways of living globally, and also we work in Canada as well. And one of the things that I've been doing, as you alluded to, is looking at how research insights around the why of why people pick up sustainable living actions can be a lever or a lens for us to be thinking about how to attract more people to these types of actions when they're supported by the right infrastructure and services and businesses that support them to do that. I think it might be worth my just noting something else that's coming up for us that would be interesting to your Canadian listeners that we're not going to speak about directly, and that's called the Live Net Zero Challenge. And we're working with Canadian Geographic across Canada to challenge Canadian households to show each other like how we can take low cost and other more intensive actions towards sustainable ways of living that help all of us achieve this goal to live within the resources that we have on our planet. So look out for that in the time ahead. It'll be at livenetzero.org, and it runs between August and November, mid-November. But today, of course, we're speaking about a guide that we've produced with the support of Récit Québec. So it'll be a guide that is in both French and in English. It's got hundreds of actions from like quick wins to bold shifts, where workplaces can really support the people that work with them to live in more sustainable ways. And so, it's not a green operations guide. It really looks at like the types of activities like biking or carpooling, as well as moving towards more plant-rich diets or reducing food waste, and like how can a company that somebody works for be supportive of that shift that all of us need to take, whether in Canada or globally. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is fascinating. Like I said, I remember the first time when I met you and the team and Professor William Rees in one of the I think it was a seminar, but also a coming together of all the sustainability geeks in the city back in 2019, I suppose. And this was the first time when I learned about the ecological footprint concept and how we could measure personally, as well as like from a corporate and a workplace and organization perspective. And I personally felt the whole ideology of like bringing back the focus on sustainability is all about energy conservation in general, and then everything else like environmental, social, and everything else is like part of that. But if we are thinking about like energy consumption needs to be like more efficient and effectively used of what we have, I think that was my biggest takeaway, and like refocus conversations around that. So yeah, thank you for all the work that you've been doing.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's definitely interesting because the conversation goes so much more around carbon and those pieces, but truly the conversation about what it is to live sustainably on this planet has to do with creating better lives for all of us and having that equity and sharing dimension to it, as well as like our natural resources regenerating. Definitely the carbon is part of it, but it's not the whole picture. And so even this guide really tries to showcase that broader conversation that needs to take place about what it is to live well on this earth.
Fabulous. Love it. Before we move on with the subjects, I also want to do a quick set of questions that we call here at movmi the movmi questionnaire.
Okay.
So I'm going to throw some questions at you for us to like learn a little bit more about your choices, your preferences, your likes and dislikes about fun things. So first thing, and first of all, you have to. I want you to agree that you're ready to take the movie questionnaire.
I'm ready.
You consent?
I'm ready.
Sounds fun. So favorite mode to travel?
Ooh, favorite mode. I would say I love taking the ferry. That's one of my favorite modes.
Brilliant. That sets well into my second question. So moving around in BC and in Canada, if you had to do it multimodal by default, what would be the best route that you would suggest?
Traveling around BC. Okay. So I found it actually remarkably easy to take the bicycle onto the ferry and then be exploring parts of like Saturna Island was the example that we did. We did a little camping trip, my husband and I. It was actually easier than I thought. It was not something I'd really done before. He's done a little more of that. So that was pretty exciting. But I would say by default, I'm a little bit more multimodal of given, I have teenagers and everything as well, but I try to loop my journeys together if I have to do multiple things at once. But I would probably connect more like car to bus to SkyTrain, like that kind of routing, or taking a bus to across to different places. Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally valid. Yeah, and there are different needs and wants why you would do multimodal. I like that route that you suggested. It's going on my list. I was like, okay, because I'm looking for like bike and ferry kind of options. So
it was a lot of fun. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that. So, and this is the loaded question. And so I won't give you a yes or a no thing. So you basically have one way to like answer this. So you like shared mobility because.
Oh, I like shared mobility. I can take a second, eh? I like shared mobility because we all have different modes that appeal to us, and also our neighborhoods are set up differently and our connection to different places. So sometimes we can do things by walking, and that's brilliant. Sometimes we need a little extra push, and a bicycle might get us there. Sometimes we want to combine like our health to things. So I like it because it gives you all of these different options that you can put together to create the best way to do what you need to do.
Brilliant. Yeah, this is great. I wish I had that answer. Okay, so this is a funny one. Dogs or cats?
Oh, cats, 100%.
Okay.
That's for me. I just adore cats, and we have one. Yeah.
I'm not going to ask why, but yes, we'll go with that. We'll go with cats. Thanks. And the last one is, if you had one mobility wish for the next year, like 12 months or a year, and you had a magic wand to wave around and make it possible, what would that be?
Oh. Free transit passes for everyone in the province, or yeah. Yeah.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Free transit. Or even if it's just in cities, right? Like I just think that that's a game changer in cities where I've seen that. Yeah.
Okay. Love it. Thank you so much. Yeah, so that's pretty much everything that we have on the movie questionnaire. So thank you for taking it, and you've passed it with flying colors.
Thank you.
Awesome. So in this interview series for Mindshift and Modeshift, this is one of the things that we started about a year, maybe a little bit more back, was the question around what comes first when we talk about like sustainability, behavior, or motivations or behavioral change. And when we talk about transportation, we are talking about modes and choosing a mode and preferring mode. So we have shifts in the modes that we prefer all the time, right? So sometimes life changes and you just went from a bike share to a car share, or bicycle to a car. But what's the mode shift motivation? And we believe Mindshift has a lot to do with that. So do we bring in Mindshift first? Do we bring in Modeshift first? What comes, what would be a precursor to the other? It always changes, and that's pretty much the discussion points for all our interviews that we've done in the series. And this is why we're talking about, OneEarth Living's motivations and guidelines and toolkits, and what you have seen overall in the broader sustainability perspective. So in this new report, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the report? And I want to get into the conversation about what's this report, what is it called, and then what's the report going to be, who's the report going to be targeted towards? And if you can give us a quick blink list version of it.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. So first of all, I love the question about whether it's Mindshift or Modeshift, and I feel very strongly that it's both, right? Because I think that when we're trying to encourage people to make a mode shift, it needs to be that it is accessible for them to do so, that it fits within their abilities, that all of these things are true. And then on top of that, we can attract them to that mode by tapping into motivations, for example. So one of the motivations in BC is healthy life and planet. And so people who are motivated in this way are really drawn to things that increase their health or increase their, their well-being. And so being able to speak about biking, for example, from that perspective, that might drive them more towards a mode shift of biking, for example, than speaking about the environmental benefits. So I think it's really both. It's like supporting people to see what the benefits are of that to their mindset. So I mentioned a little bit about this. So the Workplaces Guide, it's the Sustainable Living Action Pack for workplaces. And it's a guide that is themed around 7 different action packs. And there are hundreds of actions within it. And some of those are like quick wins, and other ones are much bolder shifts. And we try to include a real range of actions across all kinds of different topic areas. And I'll go into the topic areas in a second, but it's everything from like creating a library of things at work where people might share gear or tools or other things, or hosting a plant-rich potluck, or supporting carpooling through the workplace. And we also included things that people don't often think about. It's like those signals, like how do we celebrate the milestones that people go through in a low carbon way? So typically this would be a pen. Now there's nothing intrinsically horrible about a pen, but are there other things that could be gifted, like an experience or like other stuff like that might be really interesting when somebody retires or has a child? Could it be something that's different that really signals that low carbon way of living? Just as a note, this is meant as a global guide as well. And so we've included real life examples from workplaces around the world. Yeah. So Venkatesh, you asked as well about who it's targeted to. Do you want me to kind of tap into that a little?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think, there are a lot of guides that are aimed at operations, like a greening the workplace. And that's, those are wonderful and super important. This one here is targeted at workplaces that want to take a look at how to support their employees to live more sustainably. And we specifically chose to target the actions around ones that senior management might take on. So certainly green teams, individual employees, and others can be inspired by those actions. They might want to take them on, and there's a whole part of it where people can look at like what they might do as individuals. But the idea is that a workplace as itself would do that. And although this guide can kind of work in all kinds of settings, whether it's like a film set or a cafe or whatever, or even remote or hybrid teams, there's like examples of actions that could apply to all. We decided to put our lens really on like fixed locations. So a retail store or a university or a vet clinic or an accounting firm, like any of those types that are a fixed place where people kind of come at least once or twice a week.
Okay, and in that sense, when you mention there is a way, I mean, you already mentioned why the workplace and how it could be very effective in bringing this and pushing these motivations and bringing people together. What else can you talk about? Can you tell us about why workplaces? Like, what makes our workplaces one of the best areas to instill like sustainable thinking?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I don't know if you know this statistic, but it blew me away. Like, we spend about a third of our lives working. So if we want to shift how people are supported to eat, move, connect with each other in more sustainable ways, then the workplace actually has like an outsized influence more than you would think, right? Like more than you would think. And so when a company or an organization kind of leads by example and then creates some conditions for those shifts, they are not just creating shifts in those behaviors of those individual employees, but they're actually changing the culture. In some workplaces, one spends even more probably than a third of one's lives, I could imagine, in care settings or on film sets or other things. It's like even more extended hours. So I think that that's, just a really interesting context of why a workplace might lean into this.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, did you have anything?
No, I was, I'm happy to speak to like what those packages are, if you like at some point, but we could do that.
Yeah, we'll come.
Yeah.
I think we should be coming to that.
Great.
But we'll see. Yeah, if we miss it, then we'll make sure that we'll touch upon that. Yeah, so when you mentioned a third of our lives, my first thought was like, wait, is it not like all of our lives that we spend working? But that certainly seems right now. Especially for people like myself who's working from home.
Yeah.
So, and then when I think about like statistically for a moment, I was like, oh, right, because we also spend life includes sleeping. So, so
and hopefully some time with our friends and our family or within our community, volunteering or doing other things.
So it's basically like a third of our life, but also like a bigger portion of the life that we are awake.
Yeah, or waking hours.
Right. So waking hours is like a larger portion when you think about that. But yes, it's in general, I think it's a valid question. There was like very, very curious in my mind when I thought about like, a third, and what does it mean? When I think about like 24 hours, I'm like, okay, now I get it.
Yeah. No, it's really quite remarkable. It's quite remarkable. And it's one of the reasons why we also have these two packages which focus on well-being, because a workplace can actually have we all know it, right? Like they can have a tremendous impact on how we feel and whether we feel connected or not. And so things like even on that third, a shorter work week has an impact on sustainable living, like on sustainability, because it has real carbon impacts if you're not commuting often. But it also can make people feel good and energized and supported. And, so yeah.
I get that. And in terms of like your motivations when you ask, when during the guide, I think from the guide, it's clearly drawing out steps for the management, as you put it, or the organization to put in place. But why should employers care?
Yeah.
What's in it for them?
Yeah. So I think my answer would be kind of twofold. So I'm going to talk a little bit about employee retention and stronger team culture. So like, it's good for business. Often it can be good for business, a stronger team culture, but it's also really needed right now, given that we're in a climate emergency. We're in a situation where no matter which place we're in, we can lean into whatever possibilities there are within that. So whether it's within our neighborhoods or within our households or within our faith community, we can move the dial towards a more low carbon or more sustainable culture and more sustainable way of being. So yeah, on the good for business, it's like there's a lot of research into that. People want to be somewhere where there's alignment with their values and where they feel like supported in that. And even beyond internal, customers, clients, partners, they all notice when sustainability is more than, just a slogan, right? And when we do this in a way that is really authentic, that's really grounded, we can build trust and loyalty with our customers as well. And that helps differentiate. So it's good for business. And it gives good job satisfaction and other things, and it connects people to each other, but it's also the kind of leadership we need. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So it doesn't not just fulfills the sustainability agenda for organizations, which is a mandate for pretty much all the organizations to have. It's practical aspects. It's about productivity. It's about employee retention and happiness at the workplace. And who wouldn't want to have that?
Yeah.
Okay. That's good to know. Thank you for giving me a sneak peek of what the guide is about and what it covers. I feel very, very distinguished myself. But in terms of like the guide, I noticed there are like incentives and demonstrations. And you did talk about like your mobility wish. It's about like free transit to everybody, and how one of the other examples you stated was like providing tools and like passes to employees who would be able to use it, and gifting an experience kind of thing, right? So than products.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of like incentives and demonstrations, I could already think about a few things that are happening in some organizations, but are largely missed out. So when it comes to like bonuses and subsidies and visibility versus policy changes at workplace, which of these two levers tends to move the needle faster?
Yeah. So certain actions might move the needle faster, but the guide really focuses in on the complementarity between incentives and demonstration, and that these two together start to shift the needle. Because one of them is much more like incentives are much more focused on sparking action, encouragement, reward, subsidies, these types of things. But the demonstrations, it changes what people expect, and it creates new norms. And so when we put those in tandem, they're super powerful. And so perhaps I can just share like a couple of examples of each of those, of incentives and of demonstrations. So like incentives would include things that kind of either make it more attractive or reduce barriers or whatever to take an action. And so those could be financial support or perks from a workplace. And so one example is providing free transit passes, as you noted, or it could be something kind of simple like a newsletter entry, like a space where we talk about somebody who's been a sustainability star. Maybe they're constantly biking to work or doing something like that, and we kind of highlight them. So it's about reducing those practical barriers, but then also celebration. And they can kind of build interest where there's already momentum. offering a bonus that's equal to a parking spot would be another example of like a really, like, it's pretty exciting incentive for people to shift their modes. Yeah. And then I am thinking about demonstrations. Like, senior staff can play a role in kind of leading by example, but that could be any staff person for sure, taking the bus, using a reusable mug if they're coming into work, you know, doing those types of things, renting or using free decorations for celebrations. I just organized a grad dinner for my son, and we wanted to have a little dance component, and I went on free on Facebook and asked if anybody had a little disco light that I could borrow, rather than buying it from, you know, whatever, from the store or Amazon for whatever. I borrowed it, and myself and the woman who lent it to me just felt so happy about this. So, you know, it's like, but I was demonstrating, and I was actually, it's important to be vocal about those demonstrations. I told the other families, oh, this is where it came from, and this is really great. So it just shows in a different way what's expected, and it removes some of the friction from making those choices. It makes them more normalized. Yeah. So that's what I would say is like both important. But depending on the actions that you're talking about, like one could be more impactful, but in terms of moving the needle, both important. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I see how that is. And yeah, kudos to like leading by example in all walks of life.
Yeah, it was fun.
It was. It is. And when you think about it, these are choices that by default we tend to go the other way, and then because we don't realize how much people who've even bought the disco light don't need it every day.
Exactly.
But nobody thinks about it. In terms of like the real world examples, when it comes to like a little bit of incentivization,
Mm-hmm.
how do you think, what examples have you seen from the guide, and what we can share with the viewers today about, you know, workplace interventions that could be measured, or how they change employees' behavior to, you know, to adopt. So in terms of like there could be, you talked about parking, talks about like EV parking, one of the examples, or, you know, the city of Vancouver that we live in has like multimodal incentives. So what have you seen in terms of like something that can be measurably seen of how things would impact?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like your ask about the city of Vancouver, because to your question of measurability, they actively measured the impact of what they were doing around their sustainable commuting program. And I think it's a great case example. So maybe I'll just focus on that one. So City of Vancouver, which is a municipality, set up the sustainable commuting program, and they have transit pass rebates. They've got reserved carpool parking. They even give gift cards for rain gear for staff who bike or walk or skateboard or rollerblade to work. And they support people to build the skills. So they have like cycling skills program courses. They subsidize tune-ups. When people have an emergency, they have like a guaranteed ride home program. And the funding is all by charging employees the market rate parking fees. So that both disincentivizes people from driving because market rate is high. Often companies will go the other way, or like organizations will go the other way. This might be a point for me just to note that when we talk about a workplace, I'm saying company, but here's an example of a municipality. We took examples from like universities and nonprofit organizations and large and small companies, all kinds of different workplaces that we have. But yeah, there was a big shift that happened in commuting patterns because of it. And they just vehicle alone, so that means like one person driving on their own commuting, dropped from 46% in 2019 to just 21% in 2025 among the city staff. And so that was, you know, a great example of how if you've got these incentives that are thoughtful and really targeted, as well as infrastructure, because the city of Vancouver has been building up really good alternative infrastructure, but that can actually create a measurable shift. So this happens really well when one is super thoughtful. It's like, there are ways to get there by transit, there are ways to do these other things. So let's see if we can shift the numbers. And that's what the city of Vancouver did really effectively.
Awesome. And I love the stats. Yeah. It's pretty significant of how policy change, although not directly the employer, right? But policy change towards corporations and employers has an effect. And yes, you're totally right. The municipalities and the regional districts have quite a bit of influence and engagement capabilities that they can pull in and make this work.
And as OneEarth, sorry, Venkatesh. As OneEarth, we often also think about like how we are telling the stories of the barriers and the possibilities. So, what's nice about a municipality actually taking this on in a more real way is they're going to hear where the sticking points are. And then that can in turn shift their own policies and ideas. So, I think it's another added advantage of a municipality really leaning into this, because they are the ones who are, especially with transportation, starting to think about what's needed in the community, what's missing. And so if they create a really good back and forth dialogue, then, you have some really valuable input.
Awesome. Yes, certainly does. And this, I think the back and forth and the conversations need to happen. And only then it will be practical for anybody to implement and start on this like implementation journey, right? Speaking of which, I also wanted to ask you and understand your views of what you've seen through this project, and even like last projects that you've done from a workplace and an organization's perspective. How do they use this pack? How do they start on this journey, right?
Yeah.
So some of the organizations, as you said, including cities, they're already performing better than they think, right? And so in terms of sustainable remote share, specifically, what maybe some of their incentives are seasonal, some of them are, regional, because some have transit and some regions don't have transit. So they can't leverage transit pass when you don't have in your region. If you don't have a transit service reliable enough, then you can't leverage on that. So how did they start on a journey? And then could you also talk to our viewers about like, how does it differ between a larger organization and a smaller organization?
That's super thoughtful. And I love what you're saying also about these seasonal patterns, because one of the things that we speak about a lot as OneEarth Living, and also with the motivations, is, you have some people who have never taken a specific action before, like they've never biked, for example, or they rarely would eat a plant-based meal, for example. So those, it's a question of like onboarding, right? Like how do you remove the friction, remove the barriers, and get people to start trying and seeing whether this is something that might become more a part of their life, or even an occasional part of their life. But for many people, this is about that they're already doing a lot of these actions, but it's how do you get them to do them more often? So how do you make it something that might be seasonal, noticing those seasonal patterns, but then building from that to something that might be a year-round one, or where there's a real thoughtfulness about like what the alternatives are in rainy weather, for example. So your specific question was about how people get started. So we have, there's like really practical ways. Some of them are on action areas like stuff or food or getting around that are, really, really practical, right? And so what is helpful is to take a peek at the guide and start to take stock of what's already happening, what's already working. Most organizations are already doing, better than they think. And if we think about mode share, about modality, multimodal, maybe during good weather months, there's actually a tremendous amount of seasonal use of biking and walking, and like people might change their patterns, right? So gathering some informal data is really helpful. Who's already doing this, celebrating the folks who are doing that, and then figuring out what any barriers might be. So offering secure bike racks, if that's something that's disincentivizing. If people are using the bus, but they're finding it really expensive, or is there a subsidy that's possible that just like gets people across that? Is there a way in which folks who are already doing it can support those who aren't? Like bike to work weeks are really great, because like somebody who already does this all the time might be able to, support some folks where this is super, super new. Incentives for rain gear, like whatever those are, but those practical kind of supports that might be missing, and really listening. Like, so if a barrier is that people are like, ugh, you know what, getting there during rush hour totally freaks me out, then or it's so busy on the bus at that time I just cannot, then taking a look at your specific work case. Some organizations have very little flexibility, but others might be able to adjust work times to avoid rush hour. And that happens globally. There's like lots of examples of where people have done that. So I think it's like, that's basically it. How do you turn seasonal or occasional stuff into year-round habits? And
so,
yeah, go on.
Yeah, no. So to summarize, what you mentioned was the way to start would be to look into the kind of patterns that organizations observe within employees, right? So how do they normally commute, and what do they use, and how is their lifestyle? Is their lifestyle changing with seasons? It's not. And, which one is sustainable, which is not? And then try to maybe find ambassadors, find champions within teams to see how they can help put together some kind of a motivational program, advice, like you mentioned, the bike parking, if that's a disincentive, right? So you would know only when you're biking, pretty much at least seasonally, if not across the year, that hey, the bike parking here sucks, so it's not working, so we need something better. So maybe that's an incentive that has been a disincentive for people to not choose biking anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then something in sorts of like, even going back to your previous point of like parking, maybe look at it in a different way. Why is everybody preferring to drive to work if they are preferring to drive to work? Is parking very easy in the location, right? So then you'll have to think about like, okay, how can we take that away and try to like, disincentivize something so that the other side looks better.
Yeah.
Right. So it's about like, if it's not sweet enough, then you make the other one bitter.
Exactly.
Because there is only so much that you could do with incentivizing certain things, right? So maybe there are other ways that they can take. And I feel that you were also about to like cover the point about like, how does it differ between a large and a small organization?
Yeah. And Venkatesh, let me just jump into some of what you're saying there as well, because I think it's about being super thoughtful as an organization about how what you're incentivizing and disincentivizing. So for example, as a parent with young kids, like especially when they were younger, it was a lot of jiggle jaggle first thing in the morning, right? And so we need to be really conscious of like how we're supporting people through those different life moments, and that might look different for different people, right? And so just being able to be quite thoughtful about that. Maybe there's an incentive around an electric cargo bike, if that really helps people do those early morning things, or be able to still manage their daycare needs and their other needs, right? Or it might be that somebody is getting older and something that worked for them before isn't working for them now, so supporting them on how they might shift. And so being really thoughtful about that is helpful, and that kind of like blends into that question about the larger and the smaller organizations. So like in a smaller workplace, the strength is often this flexibility and kind of informality and being able to really listen and hear for those things. And so, a casual carpool list, or reimbursing staff for bike tune-ups, or allowing off-peak commutes, or doing those types of things are kind of sometimes easier in a smaller organization where you're really listening and thinking about specific employees' needs or specific things that are needed and abilities that you have. In larger organizations, though, it's like you have a lot of other levers. So you could do things like transit subsidies across the entire group, or have some priority parking if people are carpooling. You could invest, maybe you'd have maybe a little more flexibility to invest or funding to invest in showers or bike lockers or, those types of things. And whether you're small or big, but particularly larger ones could maybe see some gaps across their whole workforce and be able to advocate to local governments and say, this is just missing. Like, this is why this is not happening. There's not transit access here. We need to start to bring transit closer to these places where we're working. So I think each of them have different capacities that allow them to take on these actions and be able to do them in a way that is supportive of their employees. Yeah.
True. Yeah. I as somebody who runs an organization myself, and so do you, I'm also taking notes from what you're saying. So the idea is also to understand maybe, a question like, what is it that you do while you get to work, right? So to try to understand what their pattern is. Right.
Yeah.
So are you dropping off children while your work commute? Are you going back and you're going to pick up children, or you're going to do your errands? So trying to understand why you would have a motivation towards one mode versus the other. I think that's a very valuable point of trying to understand their motivations behind the mode choice. Brilliant. Thank you so much. And then before we move on to the last question, the penultimate question is about, and I love this about OneEarth Living, all your motivation guidelines toolkits is always like action focused. And this is also an action pack, as you term it. So, and this is typical your style. So what are some quick wins of that you've seen employers put into action, right? Transit pass, bike lockers, EV charging, we spoke about a few. What would you say is the best in the adoption stats for employees versus best from what's in it for the employers, like bang for buck, kind of an ROI, if I may. So hopefully there are some overlaps in that space, but what do you think comes out from your research?
Yeah. Venkatesh, you kind of mentioned a couple of them that really jumped out at us in terms of quick employee adoption. Like these subsidized transit passes, they're really easy to roll out. They're super visible, and they tend to have strong uptake if you're in an urban area with good service. And the same with like making sure that on the back end, if somebody is taking an active choice like cycling, that there are bike racks, lockers, showers. Those make it feel a lot more realistic and for people to do that and safe. And so, even really tiny incentives like a free helmet or subsidized tune-ups can lead to a big shift. So those are ones that employees are like quite likely to pick up on and that might like support people who otherwise would not. For ROI, I feel like this one that I mentioned, the flexible scheduling, has a huge impact. And so if it's possible, even for people to start their workday at home and then come in to avoid peak hours, it often doesn't cost a thing for the company, but it reduces a lot of stress and it might make it more appealing to bike or take transit or do things. The ROI of like parking versus transit subsidies, parking infrastructure versus transit in larger companies in particular, but really across the board, they cost far less to give these transit supports. And the same with, maybe there's the ability to do something different with parking spaces, like either do a little pop-up garden or give that over to a bike rack or whatever that could give. It's a low cost move, but it has a lot of symbolic value. And so I think where those kind of overlap is transit passes and bike infrastructure. They're like easy to implement. They have a strong ROI because they reduce the parking demand. And, you know, we think a lot about like how you can stack things. So you might attract people in a totally different field to like a clothing swap, but then you could serve plant-based food at that clothing swap. And so you're like stacking things on top of each other. And that allows people to experience more than one thing and to start to normalize like that's fine, right? And though they might be surprised, like we personally love Nuba, which is a wonderful Lebanese restaurant. And the food there is phenomenal, right? And it's plant-based for the most part, or their plant-based meals there are phenomenal. And so, you know, I think we can surprise people and delight people by stacking a lot of these actions on top of each other in ways that feel wonderful.
Yeah, made me hungry. It's definitely one of the go-tos for us too, as a family and friends. Yeah, I like that. I like the way of like the last point you mentioned, like, you know, if one thing's working out, maybe the second thing could be slid in somewhat into it, so people can start taking a taste of that, and then now you have enough information to see if people like it, and then it can be its own activity and initiative that you can take off. Thank you so much. Before we conclude, I want to invite you to imagine a future based on what your action pack suggests the employers do. So here's the scene.
Okay.
So in 5 years, if a considerable number of organizations implemented the guide, what could our commute look like?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I think, you know, first of all, we'd hopefully, if this is like on a big scale, we would be not seeing so many traffic jams, and we'd see more people coming by bike or on foot or in shared EVs or by bus. The workplaces themselves would change physically, like maybe there'd be more secure bike parking, things that are not physical, but that are still institutional shifts, like flexible hours, would become easier, more common. I would love to see transit passes as part of like a standard benefits package, and maybe and possibly like these parking spots, we were talking about that just now, like converted into green spaces instead. So instead of parking lots, that it's just like that, and maybe you know, people would be standing around the water cooler talking about their walk instead of complaining about the drive. And yeah, that, you know, these ripple effects that I was talking about, it's like when you get to those kinds of scales, you have better air quality in your city. You are better able to match the needs of public transit and cycling infrastructure with like what people really need and want. And so all of this could come about because our workplaces create these real and practical steps that shift the default. They shift the norm. They make remote working or hybrid options, you know, not exceptions, but they make them something that's part of a suite of things that create a better future for all of us. And that's kind of the invitation of the guide, is like, how do we support this sustainable way of living for all of us, and use the tools that we have at our workplace to make that happen.
Awesome. Yeah, and ditto to that. I think all of that, if that's a city that we all live in, transforms into in the next 5, 6, 10 years, I think that's a phenomenal use of the workplace motivations, and the power of employers and the relationship of workplace and the people. So thank you so much. This was fascinating talk. I mean, this is, for us, it's always like motivations is Mindshift, Modeshift is the action. I think OneEarth Living delivers a powerful punch in terms of like the resources that you've been delivering. And I like that your focus has been on a general sustainability side. And at the same time, in most of the action packs, I've always found something or the other which talks about what transportation choices. So it's always key to find that this is a part of a bigger goal, but at the same time, it's not the only thing that happens in sustainability. And there are, ideas from across the board from sustainability that you can find, like if Mindshift works in changing behaviorals in food and in other like intercontinental travels or like energy consumption, maybe there are some points that we could use in transportation and make that mode shift work. Thank you so
I love
much.
that. Thank you so much, Venkatesh. And listeners can find our motivations research on our website at oneearthliving.org/resources. And this guide will also be appearing there in both French and English.